On a frozen winter night in Gilded Age Boston, the Pembroke mansion blazes with light, music, and ambition. In the shadows of the ballroom stands Marjorie, the quiet stepdaughter mocked by her elegant stepmother, dressed in a gown chosen to make her disappear. But when the most powerful magnate in the city walks past every glittering heiress and asks her for the first dance, the room stops breathing. That single waltz ignites whispers, awakens buried resentments, and forces a choice between duty, desire, and a long-buried truth. Tell me in the comments, from where are you listening to this story? And what do you love most about historical romances? Boston, Massachusetts, winter of the year 1883. The Pembroke mansion stood like a palace of snow and silver, its grand windows glowing with candlelight that danced across the frozen gardens. The bitter cold of the New England winter pressed against the frosted glass, but inside warmth reigned. Golden chandeliers shimmered above damask walls, violins tuned in velvet corners, and liveried footmen moved briskly through halls scented with pine, beeswax, and rosewater. Tonight was Edwina Pembroke's triumph, or so she believed. Edwina floated through the rooms with practiced elegance, her burgundy silk file gown rustling like leaves in a storm. Every detail bore her signature, the arrangement of lilies in French porcelain vases, the imported crystal flutes placed with mathematical precision, the orchestration of social alliances disguised as guest lists. Her hair gleamed beneath jeweled pins, and her voice, though low, cut like glass as she directed the staff with a flick of her fan. She had waited all season for this night. Tonight, she would dazzle Boston's elite, ensnare its most eligible widower, and secure her place as the unchallenged queen of Beacon Hill society. And yet, in the quiet corner by the tall windows, stood Marjorie Pembroke, her stepdaughter, unnoticed, unwelcomed, and dressed in a gown chosen for her without love or care. The ivory satin glimmered faintly under the candlelight, its lace trim delicate but restrained. The modest bustle did little to draw the eye, and the pale colour, though flattering to her fair complexion, lacked the drama Edwina demanded in her own attire. Marjorie's chestnut hair was arranged in a simple Gibson coil, held by plain tortoiseshell combs. No diamonds adorned her throat, only a fine strand of pearls, a relic from her late mother, worn more for remembrance than beauty. She stood still, her gloved hands clasped gently at her waist, watching the crowd gather beneath the ballroom's gilded ceiling. She had been instructed not to speak unless spoken to, not to approach the guests, not to sit at the main table. "You are merely ornamental," Edwina had whispered earlier. "Try not to ruin the effect." Marjorie obeyed. She always obeyed. The ballroom doors opened with ceremony as the orchestra began its overture. Women in sweeping silks and velvets entered like peacocks. Men in crisp tailcoats nodded coolly to one another, their eyes scanning for political advantage or romantic opportunity. Champagne flowed. Laughter mingled with the scent of beeswax and gardenias. And then he entered, Elias Sutherland. He did not need to be announced. His arrival silenced the room more effectively than any trumpet. Tall, broad-shouldered, clad in immaculate black evening attire, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man whose name commanded industries and whose fortune whispered through the linen mills of Massachusetts. The white wing collar of his shirt framed a face carved by solitude and duty, steel blue eyes, a strong jaw, and dark hair brushed back with silver at the temples. He was 42 and widowed, a man pursued by every ambitious matron and anxious debutante in the Commonwealth. And yet, since the death of his wife 4 winters prior, he had danced with no one, spoken little, attended rarely. Tonight was an exception, a dangerous, deliberate exception. Edwina saw him before anyone else. Her smile sharpened like a blade. She advanced with practiced grace, her gloved hand ready to be taken, her words rehearsed to perfection. But Elias, as if guided by instinct or fate, walked right past her. Marjorie felt it before she saw it. A pause in the air, a hush that spread like a ripple across water, and then his voice, Miss Pembroke! She turned, startled. The crowd fell away in her peripheral vision. Only he remained, towering, composed, unreadable. Yes, sir. Her voice was breathless, not from fear but disbelief. May I have this dance? The violins trembled. Gasps whispered through the room like wind through silk. Marjorie blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. Her gaze lifted to his. For a moment she saw something in his eyes, not desire nor pity, but recognition, as if he had been searching for something long lost and had found it in her. She hesitated. No one had ever asked her before, not once, not at any ball. You may, she said so softly it trembled in the air like lace. Elias extended his gloved hand. She placed hers atop his with careful reverence. The room parted for them, not out of politeness, but shock. Edwina stood motionless, her fan lowered, her lips parted in a frozen smile that did not reach her eyes. As Elias led Marjorie to the center of the ballroom, the orchestra began again, a waltz, gentle and slow. They moved in silence, her breath barely brushing the air, his hand firm at the small of her back. Her heart thundered beneath her corset. Every step was steady, though her legs trembled. She had danced before, of course, but never like this, never with the weight of so many stares, never with the warmth of a hand that did not bruise or control, but simply held. Their eyes met only once. It was enough. In that fleeting glance, a storm of emotion passed between them. Curiosity, ache, hesitation, recognition, and something unspoken, something neither of them could name, not yet. The music slowed. The final note hung in the air. Elias bowed. Marjorie curtsied, her hands shaking only slightly. He did not smile. He did not speak. But his gaze lingered a moment longer than propriety allowed. He turned and walked away. The ballroom exhaled in murmurs and disbelief. Marjorie remained standing at the edge of the floor, breathless, marked, not by scandal, not yet, but by something far more dangerous. She had been seen, and nothing in her world would ever be the same again. The morning after the ball arrived, with the cold clarity of a January sun slicing through lace curtains. Snow clung to the window panes of the Pembroke mansion, refracting light like crushed diamonds. But within the high-ceilinged rooms, the air had turned brittle with something far sharper than frost. The ballroom had already been stripped of its splendor. The lilies were wilting in their porcelain vases, their fragrance soured by the heaviness that lingered. Crumpled invitations, stained napkins, and abandoned gloves were all that remained of the grandeur Edwina Pembroke had so meticulously orchestrated. And in the stillness of that aftermath, Marjorie sat alone near the parlor hearth, her hands resting in her lap, still clad in last night's pale ivory gown, the hem damp from melted snow. She had not slept. How could she? The memory of the music, the astonishment in the eyes of those watching, and above all the feel of Elias Sutherland's hand at her waist, still lived on her skin like an echo that refused to fade. Upstairs, Edwina paced like a caged animal in her dressing room, her silk robe clinging to her like the rage she could not disguise. Her reflection in the gilded mirror bore little resemblance to the composed hostess of the night before. Her coiffure was undone, her eyes bloodshot, her mouth drawn into a line so tight it seemed carved into her face. She could still hear the gasps, feel the sting of humiliation. How he had walked past her. She had worn her finest gown, summoned her most practiced smiles, rehearsed the conversations that would place her by his side. And yet he had seen only Marjorie. Marjorie in that timid little dress. Marjorie who had never turned a single head until last night. A knock startled her. She turned sharply. The door creaked open. Marjorie stood there, pale, composed, her eyes downcast. "You asked to see me." Edwina's silence stretched too long, brittle with fury. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "Come in. Shut the door." Marjorie obeyed without a word, closing the heavy mahogany behind her. "You must be very pleased with yourself." Edwina said, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. Marjorie blinked. I don't understand. No? Shall I remind you then? The eyes of every person in that room fixed on you like wolves scenting blood. You clung to Mr. Sutherland like some wide-eyed orphan who stumbled into the arms of a magnate and mistook his politeness for affection. I didn't cling, Marjorie said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. He asked me to dance. He asked you? Edwina's laugh was sharp, humorless. And you, poor creature, actually believe that makes it noble? Marjorie looked up. For the first time in years, her voice held something firmer than meekness. It wasn't calculated, Edwina. I didn't plan it. But you didn't refuse it either. Edwina stepped forward, her silk slippers brushing against the rug. You let him parade you in front of the entire city. You let them whisper, and whisper they did, I assure you. Marjorie swallowed. I didn't ask for any of it. No, of course not. You never asked for anything. That's your trick, isn't it? Her tone turned mocking. The perfect quiet girl. No demands, no scandal. So when you are noticed, it seems accidental, natural, but I know better. The accusation hung in the air, cruel and unearned. Marjorie's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she said nothing more. Edwina turned her back, waving her hand with disdain. You will remain indoors for the next several weeks. No outings, no correspondence. You've already embarrassed this household enough. Marjorie opened her mouth, then closed it again. She bowed her head. Yes, ma'am. And she slipped out as quietly as she had come. But downstairs, the whispers had already begun. In the kitchen, two maids discussed the ball in hushed tones over silver trays. In the foyer, a footman unfolded the morning newspaper and froze at the sight of a column penned by Mr. Franklin Dawes, society's most notorious observer of scandal and innuendo. It read, What a peculiar scene last night at the Pembroke estate. One might have expected the illustrious Edwina to dazzle, as always, but it was her mousy stepdaughter who stole the gaze of Mr. Elias Sutherland, our city's most elusive widower. An innocent dance, or the beginning of something altogether more ambitious? By midday, 3 invitations meant for Marjorie were rescinded. By sunset, no fewer than 6 women had written to Edwina expressing concern about the impressionable girl in her care. And still, Marjorie said nothing. In her small upstairs room, she sat by the window, watching the pale sky darken over the Beacon Hill rooftops. She clutched the small pearl necklace at her throat, her mind a storm of conflicting feelings, shame, confusion, wonder, and something achingly close to hope. Far across the city, in a townhouse shadowed by granite and ivy, Elias Sutherland stood in his study, surrounded by ledgers he did not read and letters he could not answer. The fireplace crackled softly, gas lamps glowed low. He held in his hand an envelope worn at the edges, an unopened letter written by his late wife almost 4 years before she died. He had never dared to read it, but tonight his fingers trembled against the seal. He had not intended to attend the Pembroke ball. He had told himself it was business, a formality. Yet when he arrived, when his eyes fell upon that quiet young woman standing in the shadows of silk and laughter, something within him stirred. A voice he had silenced long ago whispered to him, "She sees the world like you once did." He set the letter down unopened. His thoughts were not with the mills, nor the stock reports, nor the investors who awaited decisions. They were with a girl who had curtsied with trembling grace, whose eyes held more truth than all the society smiles combined. Elias moved to the window. Snow had begun to fall again. He watched the flakes swirl against the gaslit street, remembering how her hand had fit in his, and in that quiet moment he realized he had allowed sorrow to claim too many years. He had let grief define him, but something in her gaze, steady, uncertain, but unafraid, had reminded him what it meant to be seen again. Back at the Pembroke mansion, silence reigned. Edwina sipped brandy alone in the drawing-room, her features composed but her mind calculating. She would not let Marjorie win. She had not clawed her way into society to be undone by a girl in an old ivory dress. Upstairs, Marjorie lit her own candle with shaking hands. She sat at the small writing desk in the corner of her room. She wanted to write, to name what she was feeling, but no words came. Only a truth that lived in the marrow of her bones. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her, and not through her. And that truth was both terrifying and impossible to forget. The morning unfolded with that peculiar stillness only winter in Beacon Hill could offer. The air hung motionless, brittle with frost, as if the world itself had paused in expectation. Snow dusted the iron railings and granite steps like powdered sugar, muting the sounds of horse hooves and carriage wheels on the narrow cobbled street. Inside the Pembroke mansion, fires crackled discreetly behind parlour screens, and the scent of orange peels mingled with cinnamon in silver bowls, placed to impress any visitor bold enough to call after the scandalous events of recent days. Edwina sat perfectly poised in the drawing-room, her fingers curled around a china teacup, her back straight as a rod. She wore a new morning gown in sapphire silk, the bodice edged with jet beading that glinted sharply in the winter light. Her expression was calm, almost serene, yet her eyes flicked toward the clock on the mantel with every passing minute. She had received word, discreetly of course, that Mr. Elias Sutherland would be paying a call that very day. The possibility thrilled her, for despite the sting of having been overlooked at her own ball, Edwina had not lost her ambition. She believed in strategy, not surrender. The moment the butler entered with a bowed head and the words, "Mr. Sutherland is here," she rose, smoothing her skirts with one elegant motion. "Show him in," she said, her voice the embodiment of gracious authority. Elias entered with the kind of quiet presence that made even the fire seem to burn lower. He was dressed impeccably as always, a dark wool frock coat, ivory cravat, gloves in hand, and the unmistakable air of someone who did not make social calls lightly. "Mr. Sutherland," Edwina said, extending her hand with a smile carefully measured between warm and reserved. "What a pleasure to see you again." He bowed slightly, taking her hand with a brief formal touch before releasing it. "Mrs. Pembroke, do sit. May I offer you tea? Something stronger, perhaps?" She gestured toward the tray of delicacies she had arranged just that morning. "Thank you," Elias replied, his tone courteous, but his gaze already drifting past her toward the open door beyond the parlour arch. "But I won't stay long." Something in her stomach twisted. "Is Miss Pembroke at home?" Her smile did not falter, but it no longer reached her eyes. "Marjorie, yes, she is upstairs. Shall I send for her? If it would not be an imposition." "Of course not," Edwina replied, her throat tightening. She turned to the footman. "Ask Miss Pembroke to come down at once." The silence that followed stretched too long for Edwina's liking. She poured the tea with meticulous precision, but Elias made no move to take the cup. His eyes remained fixed on the hallway, as if he might will Marjorie's presence with sheer focus. When the girl finally appeared, standing hesitantly in the doorway in a soft wool dress the colour of faded violets, Elias rose immediately. Marjorie's hair was pinned simply, her cheeks tinged pink from nervousness or the cold, perhaps both. She lowered her gaze as she approached, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "You wished to see me, sir?" Elias's voice softened. "If you are well enough for a walk, Miss Pembroke, I hoped you might accompany me in the garden." The room shifted. The very air changed. Edwina's teacup clinked too sharply against its saucer. "In this weather?" she said with a light, brittle laugh. "Surely not." "I believe the cold will be brief," Elias answered calmly, not looking at her, "and I find that snow lends a certain clarity to the mind." Marjorie looked uncertainly toward her stepmother, then back at Elias. "Yes, I would like that." The girl's courage startled even herself. Within moments, Elias had helped her into a grey wool cloak lined with soft fur, her gloved hand resting on his arm as they descended the stone steps into the quiet hush of the garden. The snow had settled like lace over every branch and wrought-iron fence. The hedges, dormant and bare, had lost their sharpness under the weight of the frost. They walked in silence for a few paces, their breath misting between them. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," Elias said at last, "but I could not, in good conscience, allow assumptions to dictate my actions." Marjorie tilted her head slightly. "I don't understand." "Boston whispers," he replied, "and too often we allow it to speak louder than truth." Her throat tightened. "They believe I tried to ensnare you." He paused. "Did you?" Her eyes widened in honest surprise, but she saw the faintest flicker of amusement in his gaze. She exhaled a shaky laugh. "No, I didn't." "I know," he said gently. They walked on. Somewhere, snow fell from a branch in a soft plummet. The only sound was the faint crunch of their boots in the powder. "You carry yourself with great restraint," Elias continued, "yet I suspect there is a great deal you do not say." Marjorie looked away. "Saying things has never served me well, and yet silence, I fear, is serving you no better." She stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be seen without being judged." Elias turned toward her fully. The air between them shifted. There is great power in being seen by the right eyes. Marjorie's breath caught in her chest. She did not speak, but her eyes met his, and that was enough. At the window above them, Edwina stood behind a sheer curtain, her breath fogging the glass. Her eyes narrowed, her hands, clenched at her sides, trembled. Downstairs in the study she kept locked and away from prying eyes sat a pile of correspondence she had hidden for years. Letters from solicitors in Newburyport, legal documents bearing Marjorie's name, inquiries about a trust her late father had arranged before his death. Letters that, had they reached Marjorie, would have given her not only security but independence. Edwina had never destroyed them completely. She had kept them buried in a leather portfolio beneath a false drawer, her insurance, her control. But now, as she watched Marjorie walk side by side with a man of immense power and reputation, something inside her broke. She descended the stairs not to intercept them, but to the study, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the drawer. She retrieved one of the envelopes and stared at the embossed seal, the Pembroke crest, her late husband's final mark. She threw it into the fire. The edges curled, the wax melted, but she did not stop watching until every line of ink had turned to ash. Outside, in the hush of the snow-covered garden, Marjorie shivered slightly. Not from the cold, but from the unfamiliar ache blooming in her chest. It was not fear. It was not shame. It was something fragile and unfamiliar. Hope. Elias offered her his arm again. She took it. Neither noticed the shadow watching from the second-floor window or the smoke trailing from the chimney where the truth was burning. The ink dried faster in winter. On the morning of the 6th day following Elias Sutherland's visit to the Pembroke household, the city of Boston awakened to a chill that lingered not only in the air, but in the pages of its most widely circulated paper. At the breakfast tables of Beacon Hill and Commonwealth Avenue, steaming cups of coffee paused mid-air as society's matrons and heirs alike leaned in to read the words penned by a man infamous for wielding his pen like a blade. Franklin Dawes, the whisperer of truths and rumors alike, had written what many had only dared to speculate in hushed parlors and behind fans. The headline, printed in unassuming type, seemed innocent to the untrained eye, but its implications landed like a stone in still water. The magnolia among marble, a certain young lady's rise to the top of society's list or its bottom. What followed was a masterstroke of veiled cruelty. Mr. Dawes, with his usual flourish, painted a portrait of Marjorie Pembroke as a gentle-faced manipulator who, through calculated modesty, had beguiled one of the city's most untouchable men. He alluded to her lack of social standing, her plain wardrobe, her absence from respectable circles prior to the winter ball. He questioned the sincerity of her demeanor, the suddenness of her presence on Mr. Sutherland's arm, and whether such a girl could possibly have risen so high without some scheme behind her soft eyes and hesitant smile. He did not name her directly, but he did not need to. By midday, the Pembroke butler stood at the door with 3 envelopes in hand, all withdrawals. 2 invitations rescinded, 1 charity committee meeting postponed indefinitely. Edwina sipped her tea with infuriating serenity. "I am so sorry about this, Marjorie," she said sweetly from behind a starched lace napkin. "But it may be best to stay out of sight for a while. You know how sensitive society can be when reputations are at stake." Marjorie sat motionless at the breakfast table, her teacup untouched. The words on the page still burned behind her eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this," she murmured. "Of course not, dear," Edwina replied with a falsely maternal smile, "but perception rarely waits for truth to catch up." And then she left the room, humming as she ascended the stairs, her silk skirts trailing behind her like the tail of a victorious serpent. The hours that followed were merciless. At Mrs. Elsbeth Loring's charity tea, a gathering intended to discuss the winter coat drive for orphans, Marjorie attended out of obligation, having accepted the invitation weeks before the storm. She wore a dove-grey dress and a modest bonnet, her gloved hands holding tightly to her reticule as she stepped into the drawing-room filled with laughter and delicate porcelain. The moment she entered, the atmosphere changed. Laughter softened into silence. A few smiles turned brittle at the edges. A pair of young debutantes lowered their fans but did not lower their eyes. Marjorie offered polite greetings, forcing herself not to shrink. She approached the table of preserves, trying to occupy herself with lemon scones and honeyed biscuits. But the conversation continued behind her. Each sentence dropped like poisoned pearls into the air. "Did you see the paper? Such a shame. And she looked so innocent. A man like that choosing her, really. I heard she's already calling herself the future Mrs. Sutherland. She's not even really a Pembroke, you know. Just the daughter of the first wife." Their words sliced clean. Marjorie stood still for a long moment, then quietly left the room before her knees betrayed her. No one stopped her. No one followed. She returned home with snow in her lashes and shame clinging to her skin. The parlour was quiet. Edwina was gone for the afternoon, attending a luncheon she claimed was too delicate for Marjorie's presence. Thomas was out. The silence was a mercy. Only Mrs. Adelaide Thurston, sitting near the fire with her embroidery, looked up as Marjorie entered and immediately saw everything. "Oh, child," she said softly, "they've begun, haven't they?" Marjorie collapsed beside her, her gloved hands trembling. How do they believe it so easily? How do they twist something so brief, so small, into something monstrous? Mrs. Thurston reached for her hand. "Because your silence is convenient for their cruelty. You must learn to meet their stares with truth. Quietly, firmly. You don't need to shout to make the truth heard. I feel like I'm drowning in something I didn't even create." "You are not the first woman they've tried to drown," the older woman said, her voice filled with steel beneath the softness. "But you must remember, those who survive the tide learn to breathe differently." Meanwhile, across town, Elias Sutherland stood before the narrow door of the Evening Register building. The chill of the wind did little to calm the heat in his chest. He climbed the steps 2 at a time and demanded to speak to Mr. Dawes. The editor, nervous and slick-palmed, ushered him into a small office that smelled of ink and tobacco. Dawes arrived moments later, smiling with false ease. "Mr. Sutherland," he said, extending his hand, "an honor. What can I—" "I'll get straight to it," Elias interrupted. "Retract it." Dawes blinked. The column," Elias growled. "I want a retraction, a full apology, in print, or I file suit for defamation." Dawes licked his lips. "Mr. Sutherland, with respect, I never mentioned her by name. You didn't have to. We both know who you meant." "It's public record," Dawes said defensively. "She was at your side. At the Pembroke ball, surely you understand." "I understand what you've done. Elias said, his voice cold and controlled. "You've taken a girl who has done nothing but behave with grace and dignity and tried to turn her into a punchline for your readership." Dawes hesitated. "I can't print a retraction without proof that she didn't." Elias stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You'll wish you had, Mr. Dawes. That I promise you." And then he left, leaving the smell of fury and snow in his wake. Back at the Pembroke residence, Edwina tightened her grip on the narrative. She instructed the staff not to speak of the tea. She warned Marjorie not to write letters to unworthy correspondents. She cancelled every social call in Marjorie's name and claimed it was for her protection. Behind her measured words, there was triumph. But in the quiet hours of the night, Marjorie stood by her window, watching the snow fall in soft spirals beneath the gaslight. She felt tired, not from exertion but from restraint. She could still feel the burn of their eyes, the laughter behind their words. Yet beneath all the humiliation, a spark remained, a defiance not yet extinguished. She touched the pearl at her throat, and for the first time in her life she whispered aloud, "They may watch me fall, but I will make them watch me rise." And the snow continued to fall, silent and unyielding, just like her. The morning fog lingered low across the Charles River, curling like breath against the cold stone bridges that joined Boston's wealth and labor. Chimneys exhaled quiet streams of smoke, and carriages rattled over frost-bitten streets where gentlemen pulled their collars high and women tucked gloved hands into fur muffs. The city had begun to stir from its scandal, but not to forget it. Whispers had only dulled into murmurs, and still eyes followed Marjorie Pembroke wherever she dared appear. But on this particular morning, she did not wake to another day in her stepmother's shadow. She woke with the strange knowledge that she would step, however briefly, into Elias Sutherland's world. The invitation had arrived the night before, written in his precise, assured hand on thick cream stationery, sealed with a discreet mark. Neither boastful nor intimate, it was not an invitation to a ball or to tea. It was something far more unusual, a request for her company at his mill. The carriage that arrived to collect her was understated, the coachman polite. Marjorie wore a dark blue wool dress and a cloak lined in grey rabbit fur, her bonnet tied tightly beneath her chin. She had dressed with care, not for vanity, but for courage. The Pembroke house had not known such silence as when she descended the front steps alone and stepped into Elias's world. The mill was in Lowell, a half-day's journey into the industrial heart that fueled fortunes. As the city receded behind them, Marjorie stared through the carriage window, her thoughts colliding with the rhythm of the horses' hooves. She had never travelled alone, never been anywhere without the ghost of Edwina's voice hissing behind her ear. And now she was en route to a place where she might be more than just an ornament. When the carriage came to a gentle stop, she stepped down and blinked into a world entirely unlike the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill. The Sutherland Mill stood along a frozen canal, a proud stone edifice with tall arched windows that caught the winter light. Its chimneys stood like silent sentinels above the city. But what struck her first was not the building itself, but the people. Men and women, some young, some weathered, moved with quiet purpose, their faces marked by labor and dignity. They paused at the sight of her, not with suspicion, but curiosity. And when Elias appeared on the steps, his coat catching the wind, his expression softened by something near fondness, she felt the knot in her chest loosen. "You came," he said, offering his gloved hand. "I did," she replied, placing hers in his with a tremor that passed between them. "I've never been to a place like this." "That is why I asked you," he murmured, guiding her through the double doors. Inside, the scent of warm wool, machine oil, and fresh soap mingled in the air. Marjorie's eyes widened at the rows of looms, the humming pulleys, the workers with sleeves rolled and brows damp from effort. But beneath it all was a sense of order, of fairness. They were not driven like beasts, but respected. She could feel it in the way they stood when Elias passed, not out of fear, but deference. He walked beside her, explaining how each thread was measured, how every color was chosen, how even the smallest details could change the quality of the cloth. But as he spoke, his tone shifted, less business, more reflection. "My father ran this mill like a battlefield," Elias said quietly, as they passed the weaving room. "He believed discipline meant fear, but fear wears men down. It breaks their hands before it ever breaks their will." "And you changed that?" Marjorie asked. "I tried. My wife believed a man who builds his fortune must also build his conscience." He paused, glancing out the window to the pale sky beyond. "She died before she could see what it became." There it was again, that heaviness behind his eyes, the one that never quite vanished. Marjorie followed his gaze, then asked gently, "Was it sudden?" He did not answer at first. Then softly, "No, it was slow, long enough to hope, too long to grieve cleanly." They climbed a narrow staircase to a quieter floor, the sounds of labor fading into stillness. He opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a room untouched by time. The furnishings were elegant but unostentatious, a writing desk with inkwells, a chair near the window with an afghan folded neatly over its arm, a shelf of novels with pressed flowers marking their last read pages. "She chose everything in here," Elias said, stepping inside with reverence. "After she passed, I had every intention of closing it, but I never could." Marjorie stood just inside the threshold, not daring to intrude. "Why bring me here?" He turned to her then, eyes searching. "Because I haven't brought anyone here, and because something in you reminds me of the way she looked at the world, as if there was still softness in it." Marjorie's breath caught. "I'm not brave like she must have been." "You are," he said simply. The air between them trembled with something unspoken, not romance, not yet, but recognition, respect, the kind of quiet knowing that does not need adornment. Outside, the wind whispered through the alleyways of Lowell. But far across the city, back in the warmth of Beacon Hill, another truth stirred behind closed doors. In the stillness of the Pembroke study, Edwina rifled through the locked drawer she believed untouched for years. Her fingers found the familiar leather portfolio, the one bearing the seal of her late husband's solicitor. She had thought she had destroyed it all, but there it was again, one unopened envelope, addressed to Marjorie. It bore the markings of inheritance, of freedom, of escape. Edwina's heart thudded in her chest. She tore it open, found the contents too detailed, too binding to destroy without hesitation. The cover letter she burned, quickly, furiously, but the financial documents she held back, not out of mercy, out of strategy. To reveal them now would be to lose her control. To keep them was to retain power. And Edwina Pembroke never relinquished power willingly. But Thomas, standing silently at the threshold of the study, saw the flames, saw the envelope, saw his mother's face, tight with triumph and fear. He said nothing, but something inside him shifted, something that would not shift back. Back at the mill, Elias escorted Marjorie once more to the carriage. The sun was setting, painting Lowell in shades of amber and iron. Before she climbed inside, he hesitated. "I fear I've placed too much on your shoulders," he said quietly. "You haven't," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "You are different," he said, then looked away. "And I am beginning to understand how dangerous that is." Marjorie, with her gloved hand on the doorframe, replied softly, "It's not danger that frightens me. It's being invisible again." Their eyes met, and in that moment, he knew. He had never truly seen anyone until her. As the carriage pulled away and the snow began once more to fall, a dozen secrets remained unspoken, hidden beneath silk curtains, behind locked drawers, and in the hearts of two souls quietly beginning to unfold. The Pembroke drawing-room glowed with the pale firelight of late afternoon, the shadows of its carved mahogany panels stretching longer with each passing minute. Outside, Winter clung to the corners of Beacon Hill with stubborn tenacity. The snow had hardened into crystal sheets along the sidewalks, and the city bustled in a hush. Carriages moving slowly over frozen cobbles, gaslights flickering against a sky the colour of pewter. Edwina Pembroke stood near the hearth, dressed in deepest emerald silk, a colour chosen not by chance, but by careful calculation. The gown clung to her tall frame with commanding precision, its high collar edged in French lace, the sleeves trimmed with velvet. Every line of her silhouette spoke of power, intention, and control. Her hair, as always, was arranged without fault, each silver blonde coil fixed in place by pins tipped with garnets. She had summoned Elias Sutherland that day with a note laced in concern, masked in civility, and he had come. Now, as he stood across from her, coat removed and gloves tucked beneath one arm, she studied him with the careful gaze of a strategist. Elias, tall and broad-shouldered, wore his usual expression of calm restraint, though his eyes had sharpened with unease the moment he stepped into the room. The atmosphere between them was not warm. It was not even cordial. It was waiting. "Mr. Sutherland," Edwina said, offering a delicate smile as she gestured to the chair near the fire. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I hope I haven't taken you from pressing business." He did not sit. "I came because your note implied urgency." "Indeed." She clasped her hands, the garnet rings on her fingers flashing in the firelight. "I hesitated to trouble you, but I felt obligated to speak as Marjorie's guardian." He raised a brow slightly. "Is she unwell?" "Oh, no," Edwina said smoothly, then sighed with theatrical delicacy. "At least, not visibly. But I fear she is not suited to the attention she's been receiving. Her disposition is so delicate, sensitive to scrutiny. She has always been that way." Elias's jaw tensed. "In my experience, Miss Pembroke has shown remarkable strength." Edwina tilted her head. "A strength born of necessity, perhaps. But is necessity the same as resilience? I worry, Mr. Sutherland, that this connection forming between you may place her under unbearable pressure. People are watching, whispering." "They've been whispering since the ball," Elias replied curtly, "and yet she has held her composure with more dignity than half the women in your circle." There it was, the first crack in her porcelain facade. Edwina recovered quickly, stepping closer with feigned sympathy. "You see only what she allows, and you are a man of great reputation, Mr. Sutherland. Surely you can understand that your attentions, however well-meaning, might be misinterpreted by someone so young, so eager for kindness." Elias said nothing, his eyes narrowing. Edwina's tone dropped lower, more intimate. "She has grown dependent on your notice, on your approval. I worry that she might mistake kindness for affection, and affection for promises." He stiffened. "I've made no promises." "No," Edwina said, walking slowly toward him, her voice silk over thorns. "But women see what they wish to see, and young women, well, they can become quite lost in their imaginings." She reached for the teacup on the table, but did not lift it. Her gaze met his with slow, deliberate weight. "Marjorie is a dear girl, but the truth is she is not your equal, Mr. Sutherland. She is not prepared for your world, not intellectually, not emotionally, and certainly not socially." The fire crackled in the silence. Edwina set the cup down. "But I am." Elias blinked once, then once more, as if to absorb the audacity of what he had just heard. She stepped closer, her voice soft and calculated. "You need a partner, not a project. Someone who understands what it means to protect a name. Someone who has already earned society's trust. Someone who—" "Enough," Elias said. His voice did not rise. It did not tremble. But it cut through the room with the finality of a closing door. Edwina's lips parted, then closed again. Elias looked at her, and in his gaze there was no pity, no disdain, only cold understanding. "You summoned me under false pretenses to malign a woman whose strength you clearly fear. You insulted her intelligence, her spirit, and her worth. Do not presume to do so again." "You are making a mistake," she hissed. "No," he said, reaching for his gloves. "The only mistake was answering your summons." And with that, he left the drawing room, his footsteps measured, unhurried. But behind the calm of his exit, his thoughts burned. Later that day, the wind had softened, and the snow gave way to patches of slush that reflected the pale sun in puddles like broken mirrors. Boston Public Garden, though not crowded, bore signs of life. Children tugging sleds, dogs pulling their owners through the frost, old men reading papers on benches, each page trembling in the breeze. Elias spotted her near the frozen pond, standing by a low iron railing, her figure wrapped in a wool cloak, her bonnet tied with care. Her posture was elegant but tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He approached slowly, each step deliberate. She heard him before she turned. "Mr. Sutherland." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and yet it filled the air between them like music only they could hear. "Miss Pembroke." He stopped beside her, and for a moment they said nothing. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but rich with things unspoken. She glanced toward the white sky. "You shouldn't be seen with me. I'm not concerned with appearances." She shook her head. "You should be. They say things. I don't even know where they begin." "I try to remain composed, but I feel—" She faltered. "I feel like I'm sinking under things I didn't create, and I'm terrified that I'll ruin your name just by being near it." He turned to her fully then. "Let them say what they will," he said gently. "Let them imagine, accuse, and draw their cruel little pictures in parlors. What matters is the truth. And the truth is, when I am near you, I do not feel diminished. I feel at peace, as if I have been wandering through silence and only now remember the sound of my own breath." Her eyes shimmered. "I am not brave," she said. "Not like you think." "I think," Elias murmured, "that you are more courageous than anyone I have met, and that is what they fear." She looked away, her breath catching. The snowflakes had begun again, softer this time, like a benediction. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. It was the lightest touch, no more than the warmth of his glove against hers, but it was enough, more than enough. Across the garden, near the black carriage that waited beneath a bare-limbed elm, a figure stood half-hidden behind a tree. Edwina. She had followed. She had watched, and now, with her gloved hand pressed tightly against her lips, she turned away, her mind already coiling into its next move. She would not be defeated by a girl in borrowed wool and borrowed courage. She would burn everything before she allowed it. And above it all, the snow fell softly, hiding what had passed and what was still to come. The chandeliers inside the Boston Opera House shimmered like frozen constellations, suspended high above a sea of silk and ambition. Gold-leafed balconies framed the grand hall, while 100 whispers echoed beneath the murmured rustle of programs and the delicate clink of lorgnettes. Outside, the snow fell heavily, blanketing the city in deceptive softness. But within the opera walls, sharp eyes and sharper tongues prepared for something far colder than the weather. Tonight's performance was La Traviata, but the real drama was expected to unfold not on the stage, but in the audience. Edwina Pembroke had made certain of that. She arrived with exquisite timing, her gown a triumph of burgundy velvet and black jet beading, her hair swept into an elaborate coil, crowned with a comb tipped in garnet. Her entrance was not loud, but it was noticed. Every step, every glance was calculated. At her side walked Marjorie, clothed in soft sapphire silk, elegant but subdued, her cloak fastened with a single pearl clasp. She moved with quiet poise, though her heart thudded like a drum beneath her bodice. She had not wished to come, but Edwina had insisted with a sweetness that veiled command. "You mustn't hide forever," she had said. "We'll show them there is nothing to whisper about." But it had never been about silencing whispers. It had been about igniting them. The opera house buzzed with anticipation the moment they entered their private box. Heads turned. Fans fluttered. Marjorie felt it in the air, suspicion, curiosity, the scent of scandal ripe for plucking. Across the hall in another box, Elias Sutherland stood speaking to a senator. He paused mid-sentence when he saw her. His expression did not change, but his eyes lingered, holding hers with the kind of gaze that left no need for words. The music began, curtains rose, and Edwina made her move. In the second act, just as the audience softened into Verdi's lament, Edwina leaned slightly forward in her seat, turning her head toward the women seated behind them, 2 baronesses and the daughter of a shipping magnate. Her voice was low enough to feign discretion, but just loud enough to pierce. "It has been such a trying time for dear Marjorie," she murmured, sighing delicately. "One never expects a simple dance to become such temptation. But then again, girls without mothers often seek affection in ill-considered places." A ripple passed behind them. One of the women gasped. Another chuckled, sharp and brittle. "I do worry," Edwina continued with faux concern, "about the emotional toll it takes, being caught in the center of so much attention, especially when it's not entirely appropriate." Marjorie sat still as marble, her hands clenched in her lap. Her breath came shallowly beneath her corset. Her ears rang with humiliation. The very walls of the box seemed to close in, each word another knife wrapped in velvet. "Of course," Edwina said, placing a hand over her heart. "I have tried to protect her, but one cannot shield a girl from her own longings." The last word dripped with implication. Behind them, the murmur spread like fire through dry grass. Across the other boxes, fans moved faster, necks craned toward the Pembroke box like spectators before a duel. By the time the curtain fell on the second act, the opera house was no longer watching the stage. It was watching Marjorie. She stood abruptly. "I need air," she whispered. Edwina looked up, all innocence. "Darling, are you unwell?" But Marjorie was already moving, her cloak clutched to her chest, her gloves trembling. She fled the box, down the velvet-lined corridor, through the marbled lobby, past the curious stares of ushers and guests. The moment she stepped outside, the cold slapped her skin, harsh and awakening. Snow blanketed the street in soft drifts. Her shoes crunched against ice as she stumbled toward the edge of the square. Gas lamps flickered above her. Her breath came in ragged clouds. The humiliation pressed against her ribs like a corset cinched too tightly. It wasn't only what had been said. It was the laughter, the silence, the eyes. She didn't see the carriage that had just arrived, nor the man who stepped down from it with sudden urgency. "Marjorie!" The voice stopped her. She turned. Elias stood beneath the gaslight, his coat already dusted with snow, his face taut with concern. "I saw you leave," he said, stepping closer. "Are you—" "No," she said, her voice cracking. "No, I'm not all right." He moved toward her, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. "What she said, what they think—" Marjorie's voice broke again. "They think I'm chasing you, that I used your kindness, that I have no shame." His eyes darkened. "You've done nothing wrong." "That doesn't matter," she whispered. "They've already decided, and I—" She hesitated, the wind catching her cloak. "I can't live like this. I can't be something they pity or scorn. I would rather disappear than be your scandal." "You're not my scandal," he said firmly. "But I might be," she said, her voice trembling. "And I won't let that define you. I won't let it undo everything you've built." Silence fell between them, heavy and aching. Then, softly, Elias spoke. "My wife was sick for 3 years before she died." Marjorie blinked, startled. "I never told anyone that," he said, his gaze fixed on the snow at their feet. "She hid her symptoms. I was too absorbed in the mills, in figures and forecasts. By the time I understood, it was too late. I buried her with words I never said and time I never gave. And every day since, I've asked myself what would have happened if I had just noticed." He looked up then, his eyes wet but steady. "When I met you, I told myself it was nothing. A dance, a kindness. But that was a lie. You are not a moment. You are a reckoning. Marjorie could barely breathe. I don't know what to call what's growing between us, Elias continued, but I know it deserves truth, not silence, not shame. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I love you, Marjorie, he said finally, but I won't ask you for anything, not now, not until you are ready to walk beside me, not beneath, not behind. Tears slipped down her cheeks unbidden. I love you, she whispered back, but I cannot stay under her roof. I can't stand on your arm if I'm not yet able to stand on my own. Elias nodded slowly, solemnly. Then let me help you find your ground, and I will wait until you do. Behind them in the distance, the opera house glowed like a beacon of artifice, but there in the snow, under the gaslight, only truth remained, and Marjorie, for the first time in her life, felt what it was to be seen and not swallowed, to be heard and not silenced, to be chosen by someone who asked for nothing in return. The snow kept falling, but in her heart something long frozen began to thaw. The cold in Boston that morning was bitter and dry, a kind of stillness that warned of a coming storm. Snow clung to the rooftops like a veil, muffling the city's breath. Inside the Pembroke mansion, a different storm brewed, one of secrets, of quiet revolutions, of long-suppressed truths clawing their way to the surface. Adelaide Thurston, seated in her parlour by the embers of a dying fire, folded her hands in her lap and regarded Elias Sutherland with the calm gravity of a woman who had seen many wars. Some fought with armies, others with glances across ballroom floors. She's hidden something, Elias said, his voice low, urgent. There are pieces missing, too many. Financial notices, letters from Newburyport's trustees. Something about the way Edwina speaks of the past. It's always measured. Too neat. Mrs. Thurston nodded slowly, her eyes shadowed by thought. Edwina has always been a woman of compartments. What she cannot destroy, she hides. What she cannot hide, she manipulates. But even the most careful hand leaves a thread loose. Help me find it, Elias said. I owe Marjorie more than protection. I owe her the truth. Later that day, beneath the guise of delivering a parcel of shawls and winter linens, Mrs. Thurston arrived at the Pembroke household and moved through its corridors with the same unobtrusive grace she had always possessed. But her eyes, softened by age, missed nothing. She spoke kindly with the cook, lingered longer in the back corridor where the old housekeeper sat darning gloves, and asked after the study no longer used. The staff, bound by loyalty but softened by respect for the old woman, let small truths slip. A drawer that was always locked, letters never forwarded, whispers of names erased from mention. Meanwhile, Elias walked with Thomas Pembroke through the snow-covered garden behind the house. The young man, barely more than a boy in the face of his mother's shadow, held his arms tightly crossed as if to shield himself from more than the cold. She never let Marjorie open the mail, Thomas muttered, not meeting Elias's eyes. Said it was unladylike, said the sight of numbers and contracts would give her feverish nerves. But I saw the letters. From a solicitor in Essex, she kept them in the cabinet near father's desk, the one with the false bottom. Elias's breath curled in the air. And you said nothing. Thomas flinched. I was afraid of her. You don't understand what it's like to live with someone who measures every look, every word, who twists your silence into obedience. But I'm not a boy anymore, and I'm tired of being complicit. Later that evening, Elias returned. He did not knock. He entered the study with the authority of a man reclaiming ground. Edwina sat by the fire, her embroidery untouched in her lap, her smile too sharp. To what do I owe this intrusion? She asked, not rising. Elias said nothing at first. He moved to the desk with unhurried steps, opened the cabinet, then knelt. With precise hands, he removed the false panel, revealing a bundle of documents, yellowed but intact, tied with faded blue ribbon. Edwina stood. You had no right. I had every right, he said, rising with the bundle in hand. These letters belong to Marjorie. Her composure faltered. She would have squandered it. Elias turned slowly. A trust. A financial inheritance from her father. Annual statements, instructions for release upon her 21st birthday. You intercepted everything. She is naive, easily led. Edwina spat, her voice rising. She would have wasted it on sentiment, on books and nonsense. She would have given it all to charity or, worse, built a life she couldn't control. Elias stared at her. You mean a life you couldn't control? Her hand trembled against the back of the settee. Everything I built from nothing. I was his second wife. The world never let me forget that. Marjorie's mother was loved, adored, mourned like a saint, and I had to earn every shred of respect. You didn't earn respect, he said quietly. You demanded it. She had everything, Edwina hissed. Youth, beauty, a daughter who adored her. Even after death, she overshadowed me. I gave that girl a roof, an education, a place in society. You gave her chains, Elias replied. Silence dropped like a guillotine. It was in that moment that Marjorie entered. She had not intended to overhear, but the voices, raised in the one room always closed to her, had drawn her near. Her boots left wet prints on the carpet, but neither noticed her arrival. She saw the letters in Elias's hand. She saw the raw edge in Edwina's eyes. You knew, she whispered. Edwina turned toward her, fury momentarily eclipsed by shock. You were meant to be grateful. Marjorie stepped forward. You burned my mother's name in every room of this house. You called her soft, foolish. You turned me into a shadow and then punished me for not shining. She would have made you weak, Edwina said. I made you strong. You made me silent. Elias placed the bundle on the desk. These are yours. Marjorie stared at the faded ink, at the papers that proved her father had not forgotten her, that he had tried, that love had been waiting, locked behind deceit. I need air, she said, her voice tight. She fled the room, her breath catching as she climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Her hands shook as she reached her chamber, but she did not weep. Not yet. Downstairs, Edwina slumped into the armchair, as if the strings that held her together had finally snapped. Elias remained standing. She will never forgive you, he said. She doesn't have to, Edwina whispered, closing her eyes. I never forgave her either. The next morning, Marjorie descended the stairs with a quiet determination. She was dressed not in mourning, but in resolve. Simple slate blue, with her mother's pearl pin at her throat. She found Elias in the drawing room, gazing into the fire. I'm leaving this house, she said, but not with you. His gaze lifted, surprised, but he did not interrupt. You have given me truths, and I will never forget that, she continued. But if I leave as your rescued damsel, I will always feel small, and I don't want to feel small anymore. Elias rose slowly. Then let me give you one more thing, he said. What? Space. To become the woman you're meant to be. Her throat tightened. You already see her. I see her beginning, he replied, and I'll wait for the rest. A moment passed, then another. She stepped closer, took his hand, just for a heartbeat, and then let it go. I will send word when I am ready, she said. He nodded, and as Marjorie crossed the threshold of the Pembroke mansion, the wind caught her cloak like a banner. She walked not like a girl escaping a cage, but like a woman who had found the key in her own pocket. Behind her, the letters remained, no longer hidden, no longer ash. They were hers now. So was everything else. The first snow of March fell softly upon the rooftops of Beacon Hill, coating the city in a hushed, almost reverent silence. Candlelight flickered through the parlour windows of Mrs. Thurston's residence, a modest but elegant brownstone nestled between grander homes that had once turned their backs on Marjorie Pembroke. Now, within these walls, warmth pulsed not just from the hearth, but from something deeper, the quiet stability of a woman reclaiming her place in the world. Marjorie sat at a small writing desk overlooking the garden, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her hand. Her posture, once cautious and drawn inward like a petal afraid of frost, was now upright, decisive. She dipped her pen into the inkwell with practiced ease, then began the first of many letters, each one an assertion of her will, each stroke a quiet rebellion against years of silence. The attorney Elias had recommended, a composed gentleman named Mr. Whitaker, whose sharp mind was balanced by a genuine respect for Marjorie's autonomy, had spent the previous week guiding her through the process of reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The hidden documents Thomas had unearthed had proven damning enough to stir the courts. With Mrs. Thurston's encouragement and Elias's quiet support from a respectful distance, Marjorie had taken the final steps alone. She had signed her name with a steady hand, no longer as someone requesting mercy, but as a woman laying claim to her birthright. That morning, she had posted her final letter, a formal request to dissolve any remaining legal dependencies on the Pembroke estate. The moment the envelope left her fingers, she had paused on the porch and drawn a breath so deep it seemed to shake loose a decade of sorrow from her lungs. Inside, Mrs. Thurston observed Marjorie with the kind of pride reserved for women who recognized survival in others. "You are becoming someone they won't dare overlook again," she had said over breakfast, setting down a plate of still warm scones. "Not because of what you've inherited, but because of what you've become." Word of Edwina's public undoing had travelled fast through Boston's tight social web. What began as a whisper had, by week's end, become a thunderclap. Mr. Dawes, confronted with legal threats and evidence too damning to ignore, published a rare retraction in the next edition of his paper. The column read like a confession, a desperate attempt to retain his credibility. In light of recent discoveries regarding the inheritance of Miss Marjorie Pembroke and the verified manipulation of her household correspondence, I must formally and publicly correct previous claims made under my byline. I extend my sincerest apologies for the harm such insinuations may have caused. The integrity of truth must outweigh the convenience of speculation. It was not an apology born of conscience, but of necessity. Still, the effect was seismic. Boston's hostesses, ever sensitive to public tides, began to recalibrate. Invitations once rescinded found their way to Mrs. Thurston's doorstep again, accompanied by delicate floral arrangements, embossed envelopes, and carefully crafted phrases of regret. Marjorie accepted none of them, not out of resentment, but because she no longer needed their approval. Her days were now filled with walks through the commons, readings by the fire, and moments of stillness she had never dared imagine for herself. She was learning to enjoy her own company, to make decisions that weren't filtered through fear or the need to please. Elias visited often, never unannounced, never presumptuous. He came with books he thought she might like, updates from his factories, or letters he wished to discuss. Not business, but thoughts, reflections. Their conversations stretched across long afternoons and spilled into early evenings, often accompanied by the quiet ticking of the clock and the sound of wind against the window panes. He never reached for her hand without invitation, never presumed to kiss her cheek in greeting or in parting. And it was this restraint, this reverence, that allowed her to trust the warmth growing between them. In his presence, Marjorie no longer felt like a damsel rescued from ruin, but like a woman being met, eye to eye, soul to soul. One evening, as lamplighters moved through the cobbled streets and the scent of rain drifted through the open window, Elias brought her a book bound in worn blue leather. He set it gently on her lap, then stood with his hands behind his back, watching her read the title aloud. Poems for a New Beginning. "I found it in a shop near Tremont Street," he said, his voice low. "The title reminded me of you." Marjorie looked up, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was not awkward, but charged, like a violin string quivering just before the bow makes it sing. "I never thought I'd begin anything again," she said softly. "Not really." He nodded. "Neither did I." Their gazes held for a long moment, and something passed between them, unspoken, fragile, but undeniably real. Then, with a breath that trembled only slightly, Elias turned toward the door. "I'll let you rest," he said. "You've done a great deal this week." Marjorie rose. "Elias," she called gently, and when he paused, she stepped forward. "I want you to know, everything I'm doing, it's not to prove anything to you." "I know," he said. "It's to prove it to myself. That I am someone who can stand in her own light and not be burned by it." He smiled, and in his eyes she saw not pity, not longing, but pride. "You already do," he whispered. That night, alone in her room, Marjorie stood before the mirror. She wore a simple house robe, her hair unbound and curling slightly from the damp. For years, she had looked into this same glass and seen a version of herself shaped by Edwina's words, by Boston's cruelty, by the weight of unspoken grief. But now she saw something else. She saw a woman not defined by her suffering, but strengthened by it. A woman who had lost so much and still chosen kindness. A woman who had once been a pawn in other people's stories and now held the pen herself. From the street below, the distant sound of a carriage faded into silence. Marjorie reached for the book Elias had given her and opened it to the first page. To begin again is not to forget, but to believe that what lies ahead can be shaped by the hands that trembled yesterday. She smiled. The hands no longer trembled. They were steady now. They were hers. The estate of Elias Harland shimmered beneath a canopy of stars, its grand facade aglow with hundreds of gaslight lanterns flickering against the crisp night. Snow clung delicately to the trimmed hedges, sparkling like crystal under the moonlight, while the scent of mulled wine and winter roses lingered in the evening air. It was the anniversary of the winter ball, the night everything had begun to unravel, and tonight Elias had chosen to rewrite that story, not in secret, not in shame, but with celebration. The invitations had been embossed in gold leaf, each one delivered by hand. The words had been simple but powerful, an evening of renewal at the Harland estate. Those who had once whispered in drawing rooms and judged behind fluttering fans now dressed in their finest silks and cravats, eager to see what such an invitation truly meant. Boston society, fickle and hungry for redemption, had arrived with curious eyes and rehearsed smiles. But it was Marjorie they waited to see, and when she entered, the air in the ballroom shifted. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, a vision of serene defiance. Her gown was not pale or modest, but bold, a deep sapphire silk that gleamed like the midnight sky. The bodice hugged her form with elegance, the off-shoulder neckline framed by delicate embroidery that shimmered with each breath. Her dark hair was swept into a dignified chignon, a single sapphire comb glinting like a secret flame. No longer cloaked in the muted tones others had chosen for her, Marjorie had become the author of her own image. The crowd below paused, gloved hands stilled mid-toast, murmurs caught mid-breath, as if recognizing something rare and unrepeatable. Not merely beauty, but presence. Not just a woman returning to society, but one remaking it in her image. Marjorie descended the stairs with unhurried grace, her eyes scanning the room without trembling. She carried no fan, no reticule, only her dignity. Elias waited at the base of the staircase. He wore a formal black evening coat and a deep grey waistcoat with subtle blue embroidery, a quiet echo of her gown. As their eyes met, he did not smile immediately. There was no need. His expression was reverent, proud, and open in a way that had once seemed impossible for him. She reached the final step. He extended his hand. "Miss Pembroke," he said gently, repeating the greeting from a lifetime ago. Only this time there were no whispers behind fluttered fans, no scandal rising like smoke in the corners of the room. Only silence, only anticipation. Marjorie placed her hand in his. "Mr. Harland," she replied, her voice calm, unwavering. He led her onto the polished dance floor, the marble beneath their feet, catching the golden glow of the chandeliers above. A hush fell over the gathering as the orchestra swelled to life, violins lifting into a melody that spoke of second chances and hearts made new. They began to dance. It was not the hurried, nervous movement of their first waltz. This was measured, intimate. Each step was a conversation, each turn a vow. His hand rested at the small of her back with quiet protectiveness, hers on his shoulder, fingers light but sure. Their eyes remained locked, not out of necessity, but because neither wished to look away. As they moved, Elias leaned in, not closely enough to draw scandal, but enough that his breath stirred a curl near her ear. "I visited her," he said. "My wife. I brought violets. She always loved them." Marjorie's heart did not falter at the mention. She had long understood that Elias's love for his late wife was not a shadow she must fear, but a wound he had once believed would never close. "I told her I had forgiven myself," he continued softly, "and that I would not spend another year punishing myself for what I could not control." Marjorie tightened her hold slightly, the gesture full of quiet compassion. "I thanked her," he said, "for teaching me how to love in silence, and I told her I had found someone who reminded me that love should be lived out loud." Marjorie felt the sting of tears, but did not let them fall. "Not here. Not now." "I'm proud of you," he added, his voice trembling, "not for choosing me, but for choosing yourself." The music soared, and they turned in unison, the train of her gowns sweeping like velvet waves across the floor. As they glided across the ballroom, she replied softly, "I would have stayed in that house forever if not for you." Elias looked stricken. "But not because I needed you to rescue me," she clarified, her voice steady and full. "Because I didn't know I had a choice. You showed me that I did, and tonight I'm choosing this." She looked around the room, at the faces once so cruel, now softened with something like admiration or guilt. "I'm choosing not to hide, not to whisper, and not to accept only the shadows others assign to me." They reached the center of the ballroom, just as the music quieted. Elias raised her hand slowly, reverently, and turned her once beneath the light of the chandelier. As the final note lingered in the air, he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. The room erupted into applause, not the obligatory kind, but thunderous and sincere. In that moment, something healed, not just between them, but in the very fabric of the society that had once tried to silence her. Later in the evening, Elias stood before the crowd with a glass of champagne in hand. "I stand before you not to host a ball," he said, voice strong and clear, "but to celebrate a woman who reminded me what integrity looks like, who reminded this city what dignity means." He turned to Marjorie, eyes shining. "She has reclaimed what was hers, not just her inheritance, but her voice, her future. And I have never been more honored to walk beside someone," he raised his glass, "to Miss Marjorie Pembroke." The room echoed his words. That night, as laughter mingled with music and old grudges crumbled beneath the weight of truth, Edwina Pembroke packed her trunks in silence. The papers had published the details of her deceit. Invitations had ceased. Eyes turned cold in the streets. She slipped from the city in a carriage before dawn, her name a whisper no one cared to revive. But Marjorie remained, and as the last guest departed and the candles burned low, she stepped onto the estate's veranda beside Elias. The air was sharp with winter, but her hands were warm in his. They did not speak of forever, they did not need to. In the silence, with the stars above and the frost at their feet, they simply stood. Two souls no longer waiting to be saved, two souls choosing. And in that stillness, a new story began. The snow fell softly over Boston that morning, blanketing the streets in a hush that made the world feel suspended in time. The city had changed, taller buildings, electric lamps casting golden halos, and the echo of a new century fast approaching. But in a quiet estate nestled just beyond the city's roar, time had learned to move with grace, not haste. Marjorie stood at the tall windows of the nursery, her hands gently resting on the edge of the cradle. A boy of 7, with a head full of dark curls and solemn eyes, a mirror of his father, sat on the floor near the hearth, sketching with precise concentration. A smaller girl, barely 4, twirled in a circle in her woolen dress, singing a tune she claimed to have dreamt. They were named Samuel Elias and Clara Violet. Outside, the garden still bore the archway, under which she and Elias had once walked as mere strangers navigating their grief. Now it was trimmed with ivy and lined with lanterns, waiting for dusk to bring the children's laughter beneath it once again. 8 winters. 8 years since she had stepped into that ballroom in sapphire silk, choosing to stand in her own light. 8 years since Elias had kissed her hand in front of Boston's elite and erased a past heavy with shame. They had not married immediately. That, too, had been her choice. They waited until the papers no longer printed her name with venom and until no part of her joy felt borrowed or conditional. When they wed, quietly, in the chapel behind Mrs. Thurston's home, it was not to repair a reputation, it was to build a life. Elias had sold one of his mills, claiming he preferred quiet evenings over empire. He still attended meetings, but only those he deemed worthy of time away from his children's stories and Marjorie's hands in the garden. The grief he once carried like an iron weight had softened, not disappeared, and in its place lived something tender, a reverence for the fragile beauty of second chances. Marjorie, once a name mocked in society's cruel games, now sat on the board of a foundation that funded scholarships for orphaned girls. She had her own letterhead, her own office, her own voice. Occasionally, young women wrote to her, thanking her not for her charity, but for showing them that womanhood could be rewritten. Mrs. Thurston had passed 2 years prior, her final days spent beneath quilts stitched by Marjorie's own hands, the children reciting poems by her bedside. In her will, she left the house to Marjorie as a symbol of what no flame could burn. They visited it often. Samuel called it Nana's House of Peace. And Edwina? The society pages never mentioned her again. Rumours floated. Paris, disgrace, an attempt to reinvent herself under a false name. But none held weight. What was certain was this: she had lost the one thing she clung to, control, and no apology had ever come. Sometimes Marjorie dreamed of her, not out of fear or hatred, but with the strange sorrow of unfinished stories. There were people in life you forgave for your own peace, not because they deserved it. As the snow thickened, Elias appeared behind her, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. His hair was streaked with silver now, but his eyes had only grown more certain. He pressed a kiss to her temple, and for a long moment they watched their children together in silence. "She twirls like you used to," he murmured, watching Clara's small boots leave fleeting prints on the rug. "She dreams like you," Marjorie replied, her voice warm. Outside, bells rang faintly from a distant church tower, and somewhere beyond the hills, a train rumbled. Its sound no longer a threat, but the pulse of a world they had chosen to meet on their terms. "I sometimes wonder," Elias said softly, "how different life would have been if you hadn't gotten off that train that night." Marjorie turned to him, her eyes luminous with memory. "I would have found my way," she whispered, "because you taught me I could." He took her hand then, their fingers still fitting perfectly, as they had on that first cold night in the garden. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, love endured, not as a rescue, not as possession, but as a vow renewed with every quiet dawn. And in the room where their children played, history had changed its course, carried not by scandal, but by the soft, powerful footsteps of a woman who had once walked in silence, and now walked in her own light. There are stories that remain etched in the soul long after the final curtain falls. Stories like Marjorie's, where dignity rises from disgrace, and where love is not a rescue, but a choice made with open eyes and a healed heart. Through betrayal and injustice, Marjorie taught us that silence can become voice, shadows can yield to light, and that true strength lies not in perfection, but in resilience. Perhaps, like Marjorie, you felt overlooked or underestimated. Perhaps you've fought to reclaim your worth in a world eager to define you. This story is a reminder: your past does not determine your future, and no one has the right to dim the light you carry within. If you've journeyed with us all the way to this final moment, write the word sapphire in the comments. Let's make it our quiet symbol of courage, elegance, and rebirth. If this story moved you and you wish to support the passionate team behind these heartfelt productions, consider sending a super thanks here on YouTube with whatever amount you feel inspired to give. Your kindness helps keep these love letters from the past alive and accessible to all. And if you can't give in that way right now, your support is still deeply meaningful. Simply sharing this video with someone who loves emotional historical tales is a beautiful way to help. Don't forget to check the end cards. We've added more romantic journeys filled with longing, redemption, and timeless love, waiting just for you. Thank you, from our hearts to yours.